My name is Miranda Foster. I'm 32, living in Chicago, and for the past 2 years, I've been paying $5,600 a month toward my parents' mortgage. I wasn't living there. I wasn't on the deed. But I was told it was temporary, to keep the family home afloat. Then, one morning, I got a text from my mom. "We've changed the locks and the gate code. We no longer trust you." No warning. No explanation. Just exile. I stared at my screen in shock and replied with 5 words I'll never regret. Understood. Very smart. But you overlooked one thing. Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal, not from strangers, but from the very people who were meant to shield you, love you, stand in front of you when the world got cruel, but instead, they stepped aside and let it hurt you? The kind of betrayal that rips through the fabric of your reality, leaving you gasping in the empty space where trust once lived? It hits you, a physical blow, leaving no marks on the skin but etching itself deep into the soul. The shock is immediate, a cold current that electrifies every nerve ending, followed by a searing, hollow ache. It's the moment your world tilts on its axis, and everything you believe to be true crumbles to dust around your feet. The air leaves your lungs, not in a scream, but in a silent, agonizing gasp. This isn't just hurt. It's the raw, undeniable reality of being discarded, of being told, without words, that you are no longer valued, no longer seen, no longer safe within the very fortress you believed was built for you. Before the storm, there was a quiet hum, a rhythm I had come to know as my life. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was mine, woven with threads of routine and the subtle comfort of familiarity. My apartment, a sun-drenched sanctuary on the 5th floor of a pre-war building in a quiet Chicago neighborhood, smelled of brewing coffee in the mornings and the lingering scent of rosemary and garlic from last night's dinner. I remember those dinners so vividly. The clinking of forks against ceramic plates, the low murmur of Daniel's voice as he recounted his day, the soft jazz playing from the speaker in the corner. We'd sit at our small, reclaimed wood table, the evening light spilling through the large windows, painting stripes across the worn rug. Sometimes we'd talk for hours, dissecting the mundane and the profound, our hands finding each other across the table. Other times we'd simply exist, content in the shared silence, the unspoken understanding that filled the space between us. It was a life built on small, deliberate choices, each one aimed at creating a sense of stability, of peaceful contentment. My work, too, was a source of quiet satisfaction. As a marketing manager for a mid-sized tech company, my days were filled with deadlines, strategy sessions, and the constant hum of digital communication. I thrived on the challenge, on the tangible results of a successful campaign, the quiet satisfaction of seeing my ideas take shape and gain traction. The office was a sea of cubicles, a vibrant mosaic of focused energy, but I always found my corner, my rhythm, in the organized chaos. My colleagues were more than just coworkers. They were a supportive network, a group of bright, ambitious individuals who pushed me, challenged me, and celebrated my successes with genuine enthusiasm. Lunch breaks were often spent in the small park nearby, the city sounds fading into the background as we shared stories and laughter, momentarily escaping the demands of our professional lives. These were the moments, the everyday moments, that formed the bedrock of my existence. They were the anchors, the quiet certainties that allowed me to navigate the complexities of adulthood with a sense of purpose and groundedness. Weekends were a different kind of calm. Saturday mornings often began with a long run along Lake Michigan, the crisp air invigorating my lungs, the vast expanse of water stretching out before me, a calming blue against the city's skyline. I'd lose myself in the rhythm of my steps, the gentle pounding of my feet on the pavement, the repetitive motion, a meditation that cleared my mind and sharpened my focus. Afternoons were for browse the farmer's market, the vibrant colors of fresh produce and the earthy scent of herbs filling the air. I loved the simple ritual of selecting ingredients, imagining the meals they would become. Evenings were often spent with Samantha, my best friend since college. We'd share a bottle of wine, a takeout pizza, and endless conversations about everything and nothing. Her apartment, filled with mismatched furniture and stacks of well-loved books, felt like a second home, a place where I could shed the armor of the professional and simply be. We'd talk about our dreams, our anxieties, the silly triumphs and minor setbacks of our lives, her laughter a comforting echo in the small space. Sundays, however, were reserved for family. A mandatory pilgrimage to the suburbs, to the house I grew up in, a grand, colonial-style home that had always felt more like a monument than a dwelling. Dinner was always at 6, a ritual as ingrained as the changing seasons. My mother, meticulously dressed even for a casual family meal, would preside over the table, her eyes constantly scanning, assessing, judging. My father, often quiet, would interject with a dry comment or a pointed question, his presence a heavy weight in the room. And then there was Brittany, my younger sister, a whirlwind of exaggerated emotions and dramatic pronouncements. She was the sun around which my parents' world revolved, their pride and joy, their endless source of conversation. I, on the other hand, was the quiet achiever, the responsible one, the one who didn't need attention. My accomplishments were met with a nod, a brief acknowledgement, before the conversation inevitably swung back to Brittany's latest endeavor, her newest artistic pursuit, her most recent romantic entanglement. It was a dynamic I had accepted years ago, a silent understanding that my role was to provide stability, to be the background against which their vibrant drama unfolded. I never questioned it. I never pushed back. I simply existed within the framework they had built, believing that this was what family was, this quiet acceptance of one's place. It was a life, I thought, that was predictable, secure, and ultimately safe. The quiet hum of my life, the one I had come to rely on, began to shift. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, like the first faint rumblings of an earthquake far beneath the surface. It started with small things, easily dismissed. A forgotten promise from my mother, a casual remark about a family gathering that I hadn't been informed of directly, only stumbled upon through a half-heard phone conversation between my parents. Then there were the texts. Ambiguous messages from my father, asking about my schedule, seemingly innocuous questions that felt laden with an unspoken agenda. "Are you busy this weekend, Miranda?" he'd text, not for a specific reason, but just asking. And then the weekend would pass, and I'd hear from Brittany that they had gone to the lake house or had a barbecue, events I hadn't been invited to. It was a prickle of unease, a fleeting thought that something was off, but I pushed it down, attributing it to their typical disorganization, their casual disregard for my presence that I had long grown accustomed to. Then came the money. The requests, initially subtle, grew steadily more direct. A loan for my mother's new car, quickly followed by help with an unexpected medical bill for my father. These weren't loans, not truly. They were requests, delivered with an air of expectation, an unspoken assumption that I would provide, as I always had. I found myself adjusting my budget, canceling my own plans, quietly funneling my savings into their growing list of needs. The condo I had been saving for, a dream I had been nurturing for years, began to feel like a distant mirage. Each transfer of funds was accompanied by a strange, hollow feeling, a sense that I was pouring my resources into a bottomless pit, a chasm that only seemed to expand the more I gave. Yet, I told myself it was family. It was what you did. It was love in its own unspoken, transactional way. The unease deepened with Brittany's visits. She would arrive unannounced at my apartment, her eyes bright with an almost frantic energy, her voice a little too loud. She'd ask about my job, my finances, the details of my life that she usually ignored. Her questions felt less like genuine interest and more like an interrogation, a probing for information that she seemed to be collecting, cataloging. She'd linger, sometimes for hours, her presence a heavy weight in my small, organized space. I'd offer her tea, a snack, try to engage her in light conversation, but her focus remained unnervingly sharp, her gaze too intense. She'd make vague comments about family solidarity, about helping each other out, words that sounded comforting on the surface, but held a brittle, almost threatening edge beneath. There was one evening I remember distinctly when she looked at me, really looked at me, with an odd expression, a mix of pity and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. "You always do what they want, don't you, Miranda?" she'd said, her voice softer than usual, almost a whisper. And then, just as quickly, the expression vanished, replaced by her usual flippant demeanor. The moment hung in the air, a fleeting shadow, before she changed the subject, laughing too loudly about some trivial matter. It left me with a chill, a feeling that something insidious was brewing beneath the surface of our seemingly normal family interactions. Even Daniel, my steadfast, observant Daniel, began to notice. He would watch me as I scrolled through my phone, my brow furrowed, a faint sigh escaping my lips after another vague text from my parents. "Is everything all right, love?" he'd ask, his voice laced with concern. I'd brush it off, of course, a practiced deflection. "Just family stuff," I'd say, forcing a smile. But he wasn't easily fooled. He'd seen the subtle shifts in my mood, the way my shoulders would tense when the phone rang, the quiet exhaustion that seemed to settle over me after a Sunday dinner. He started offering to come with me to these family gatherings, a silent offer of support, a protective presence. I always declined, wanting to keep my family drama separate from our shared life, wanting to believe I could handle it on my own. But his knowing glances, his gentle squeezes of my hand, only amplified the growing sense of unease within me. It was like a slowly tightening knot in my stomach, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind that something was terribly wrong, that the foundations of my world were shifting, imperceptibly at first, but with a quiet, relentless force. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress or overthinking. But the doubt, once a tiny seed, was beginning to sprout, its roots digging deeper with each passing day. The calm before the storm was dissipating, replaced by an unsettling atmospheric pressure, a palpable tension in the air, waiting for the inevitable crack. The shatter moment didn't arrive with a bang, but with a quiet, sickening thud. It was a Sunday, ironically, the day reserved for family, for the illusion of togetherness. I had driven out to the suburbs, the usual ritual, the familiar route passing through tree-lined streets, past houses that held a lifetime of other people's stories. The air in the car was heavy with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I walked up the familiar flagstone path, the scent of my mother's meticulously manicured rose garden hanging faintly in the humid air. The front door was already ajar, a sliver of light spilling out, and I heard voices from within, their tones unusually hushed, almost conspiratorial. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, a strange chill creeping up my spine. As I stepped inside, the usual Sunday chaos was notably absent. No clatter from the kitchen, no television blaring, just an eerie silence that amplified the low murmur of voices coming from the living room. My parents and Brittany were gathered there, seated on the plush antique sofa, their faces turned towards each other, their expressions serious, almost grim. They didn't immediately notice me. I stood in the entryway, a silent observer, feeling suddenly like an intruder in my own childhood home. Then, my mother looked up, her eyes wide, a fleeting expression of surprise, perhaps even guilt, crossing her face before she quickly composed herself. My father shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering away from mine. Brittany, ever the dramatist, simply stared, her lips pressed into a thin line, a strange mix of triumph and discomfort in her eyes. "Miranda," my mother began, her voice unusually formal, "we need to talk." I walked into the living room, a slow, deliberate movement, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet, each sound amplified in the heavy silence. I sat on the armchair opposite them, my back straight, my hands clasped in my lap, a quiet calm settling over me despite the rising storm within. I knew, instinctively, that this was it. The shoe was about to drop. My father cleared his throat, a nervous habit. "Miranda, your mother and we've been having some discussions about the house." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I kept my face impassive, my gaze steady. "As you know," my mother continued, her voice carefully modulated, "the mortgage has been a burden." I almost laughed. a burden I had shouldered for 2 years, to the tune of over $130,000. Brittany, my father interjected, his voice gaining a surprising firmness. Brittany has been looking for a place of her own. She's decided she wants to live closer to us, to be here for us, to help out more. My eyes flickered to Brittany. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, her lips still pressed tightly together. She couldn't meet my gaze. And my mother said, her voice softening, a saccharine sweetness coating her words, she's decided. She wants to move into the house. To take over the payments, truly make it her own. The words hung in the air, a poisoned dart, striking me precisely where it would inflict the most damage. I felt a cold wave wash over me, a physical sensation of blood draining from my face. My jaw tightened. I felt the slow, steady creep of disbelief, then a searing, white-hot pain. They were giving the house I had saved to Brittany. The house I had sacrificed my own dreams for. The house I was still paying for every single month. Of course, my father added, his voice a little too loud, filling the sudden silence. This means you won't need to contribute to the mortgage anymore, Miranda. It was a dismissal. A polite, carefully worded dismissal. They weren't asking me to stop, they were telling me. They were cutting me out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. There was no dramatic outburst, no heated argument. The devastation was too profound for theatrics. It was a quiet, internal collapse. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what they were saying, to process the betrayal that felt so cold, so calculated. Every sacrifice, every canceled plan, every penny I had poured into that house, into their lives, flashed before my eyes. And for what? To be summarily replaced, pushed aside for the favorite daughter. I understand, I said, my voice barely a whisper, a strange, hollow sound that didn't even feel like my own. My lips felt numb. My mother, sensing the lack of a scene, seemed to relax, a faint smile touching her lips. We knew you'd understand, darling. You're so practical, so sensible. We just thought it was time for Brittany to have her turn. Her turn. My turn had been to fund their existence, to be the invisible support beam holding up their carefully constructed facade. And now my utility had expired. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling strangely heavy, detached. I looked at my parents, their faces a blur of self-satisfaction and carefully concealed relief. Then I looked at Brittany, who was still avoiding my eyes, her face flushed. I'll be leaving now, I managed to say, the words catching in my throat. No one tried to stop me. No one offered an apology, a word of comfort, a gesture of understanding. They simply watched as I walked out of the living room, through the silent house, and out the front door, the scent of roses now a bitter mockery. The world outside felt strangely muted, the colors duller, the sounds muffled. I got into my car, the familiar hum of the engine a small comfort in the overwhelming silence of my own mind. I drove, not knowing where I was going, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The tears came then, not in a torrent, but in a slow, steady stream, blurring my vision. They were not tears of anger, not yet. They were tears of pure, unadulterated grief. Grief for the family I thought I had, for the trust one had so freely given, for the innocent belief that love meant protection, not exploitation. It was a quiet devastation, a profound shattering of every preconceived notion I had held about my place in the world, about the people who were supposed to be my safe harbor. My world had changed, irrevocably, silently, and I was left to pick up the pieces, alone in the wreckage. The quiet devastation lingered, a suffocating blanket woven from grief and disbelief. But beneath its heavy folds, something else began to stir. Not anger, not yet. Anger felt too loud, too chaotic for the profound stillness that had settled within me. It was a cold, clear clarity. A stark understanding that the world I had inhabited, the narrative I had built around my family, was a carefully constructed fiction. And now, the illusion had been shattered, revealing the stark, unyielding truth beneath. I retreated. Not into despair, but into a deep, introspective silence. My apartment, once a sanctuary, became a strategic command center. I spent hours simply sitting, staring out the window, watching the city below, its endless movement a stark contrast to the stillness within me. My mind, usually bustling with thoughts, was eerily quiet, save for one persistent question, echoing in the hollow space left by betrayal. What now? The answer didn't come in a flash of insight, but in a slow, deliberate unfolding. It began with the quiet observation of my own reactions. There was no urge to lash out, no burning desire for immediate retribution. The betrayal had cut too deep for such a superficial response. Instead, there was a profound sense of self-preservation, a nascent understanding that the first step to rebuilding was to protect what remained of myself. I stopped taking their calls. The initial flurry of texts and voicemails, a frantic chorus of "Are you okay?" and "Why aren't you answering?" quickly faded into a stunned silence. I let their calls go to voicemail, listening to their increasingly agitated messages with a detached curiosity. My mother's voice, usually so controlled, began to crack with thinly veiled panic. My father's tone, always so dismissive, held an edge of bewilderment. Even Brittany, in one particularly dramatic voicemail, accused me of being heartless, of abandoning them. Each message, rather than eliciting guilt, only reinforced the chilling clarity that had begun to form within me. They weren't concerned for me. They were concerned for the loss of their financial pipeline. Then came the quiet planning. It started small. I opened a new spreadsheet, a simple document that would become my fortress of facts. I began to meticulously gather evidence. Bank statements, email exchanges, text messages, every single piece of communication that documented my financial contributions to their mortgage. The numbers piled up, stark and undeniable. Over 2 years, month after month, the steady outflow of my hard-earned money into their account. It was a cold, hard sum, a physical manifestation of my sacrifice and their exploitation. Each entry on the spreadsheet was a quiet affirmation of the betrayal, and a silent promise to myself that this would not go unacknowledged. I stopped going to Sunday dinners. The thought of sitting at that table, of pretending that everything was normal, of enduring their carefully crafted narratives, was unbearable. I simply didn't show up. When my mother finally called, her voice tight with disapproval, I kept my responses brief, polite, and devoid of emotion. "I'm not feeling well," I'd say, or "I have other plans." No explanations, no apologies, no room for argument. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt monumental, a tiny crack appearing in the facade of my lifelong compliance. My internal monologue shifted. The self-doubt, the endless questioning of my own worth, began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of quiet determination. I started to see myself not as a victim, but as an observer, a strategist. I analyzed their patterns, their motivations, their predictable reactions. Their reliance on me, their easy assumption of my perpetual availability, was now a weakness I understood, a lever I could, if necessary, eventually press. This wasn't about revenge in the explosive, dramatic sense. It was about reclaiming my agency, my power, my life. It was about recognizing that their betrayal, while deeply painful, had also served as a brutal, undeniable awakening. I confided in Daniel, slowly, carefully, over several evenings. He listened, his presence a comforting anchor in the shifting landscape of my emotions. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He simply listened, his hand often finding mine, his eyes reflecting the quiet pain he saw in mine. His unwavering support was a silent balm, a powerful counterpoint to the family's casual cruelty. He helped me see the situation not as a failure on my part, but as a profound failure on theirs. "You did everything right, Miranda," he'd say, his voice gentle but firm. "Their actions have nothing to do with your worth." His words resonated, slowly chipping away at the lingering self-blame that had subtly woven itself into my psyche. I also reached out to Samantha. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Cancel those payments, Miranda. Let them drown in their own mess." Her raw, unadulterated anger was a cathartic release, a voice for the fury I hadn't yet allowed myself to fully feel. But even in her passionate outrage, she understood the deeper need for a measured, strategic response. Just make sure you protect yourself, she advised, her voice softening. Gather everything. Every single piece of paper. And so I continued to gather, to document, to build my case, not for a legal battle, but for my own sense of self-preservation and vindication. The internal shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but profound within me. The sense of being a victim began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. I was no longer reacting to their actions, I was anticipating them. I was no longer defined by their expectations, I was defining my own path. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache, but it was now overlaid with a new sensation, the exhilarating, terrifying clarity of true self-reliance. I was preparing myself, not for a fight, but for a fundamental reshaping of my life, a silent, powerful transformation from the inside out. The woman who had quietly absorbed every slight, who had endlessly sacrificed, was beginning to disappear, and in her place a new, stronger iteration was quietly, meticulously being forged. The turn didn't announce itself with a trumpet blast, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a subtle change in the pressure. It was like watching a slow-motion video of a falling domino, knowing exactly when and where the next one would topple. My silence, once a sign of my quiet endurance, had become a weapon they couldn't comprehend. They expected immediate capitulation, desperate pleas, or, at the very least, a dramatic outburst. What they received was nothing. And that nothing, I realized, was unsettling them more than any confrontation ever could. The first domino fell with a series of increasingly frantic phone calls from my mother. Her initial carefully composed anger gave way to thinly veiled panic. Miranda, the mortgage payment, it hasn't gone through. Is there a problem with your bank? Her voice, usually so saccharine, was laced with an unfamiliar tremor. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't reply to the subsequent texts, each one more urgent than the last, their tone shifting from exasperation to outright pleading. They still believed it was an oversight, a technical glitch, a momentary lapse on my part. They still believed I was their endless reservoir of financial rescue. They were wrong. Then came the escalation. My father, whose pride usually kept him from directly addressing anything he perceived as weakness, called. His voice was strained, the usual condescension replaced by a clipped, almost desperate edge. Miranda, this is serious. We're getting late notices. What is going on? I allowed myself a small, internal smile. The silence, I realized, was now screaming louder than any words I could utter. I replied with a single, carefully chosen text. Please refer to my bank statements. My contributions ceased on July 1st, as per your instruction to no longer trust me, and the changing of the locks. I didn't elaborate. I didn't accuse. I simply presented the undeniable facts, a cold, hard mirror reflecting their own actions back at them. The power, for the first time, had shifted. They had given me the instructions, and I had simply followed them. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Brittany, predictably, launched a full-scale assault via text. You are literally destroying our family, Miranda. How can you be so selfish? We need that money. Her words, once capable of inflicting deep wounds, now felt hollow, desperate. They were grasping at straws, trying to pull me back into the narrative of the bad daughter who was letting them down. But I was no longer playing that role. I simply archived her messages, collecting them as further evidence of their unraveling. The true turning point, the moment the balance of power decisively shifted, came with Aunt Catherine's call. Aunt Catherine was my father's older sister, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had always viewed my parents' dramatic antics with a healthy dose of skepticism. She was the family's quiet observer, the one who saw everything but rarely intervened. Until now. Miranda, she said, her voice low and direct, your parents are in a complete tailspin. They thought they had you locked out and locked down. They didn't anticipate you'd lock them out of your wallet. There was a wry amusement in her tone, mixed with a genuine concern for the impending disaster. They're talking about foreclosure. They're panicking. Your mother called me, crying, asking me to intervene. My heart, which had been encased in ice for weeks, felt a faint flicker of warmth. Not satisfaction in their pain, but a surge of validation. Someone else saw it. Someone else understood. They're calling a family meeting, Aunt Catherine continued, a proper intervention. They want you there. They think you'll cave. And what do you think, Aunt Catherine? I asked, my voice calm, steady. I think you hold all the cards, Miranda. And I think you should play them. Not for revenge, but for yourself. For the years they took from you. That conversation was the spark. It was the moment I realized I wasn't just defending myself, I was taking control of the narrative. I wasn't just protecting my financial future, I was reclaiming my worth. I wasn't just pulling back, I was stepping forward into a new kind of power. I agreed to the meeting. Not because I felt obligated, but because I knew it was the final act of this particular drama. I needed to be there, not as a victim, but as the protagonist of my own story. I needed to look them in the eye and say, clearly and unequivocally, no more. Daniel, sensing the weight of the moment, offered to come. His presence, his quiet strength, was a silent affirmation of my resolve. He wouldn't speak for me, but he would stand with me, a visible symbol of the new life I was building, a life unburdened by their endless demands. The air in the family home was thick with unspoken tension when we arrived. My parents looked haggard, their usual veneer of composure cracked and frayed. Brittany sat beside them, her eyes red-rimmed, her face a mask of aggrieved innocence. The extended family, a collection of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had always stayed on the periphery of our family drama, were present too, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. They were there to witness, to perhaps even judge. But I wasn't there for them. I was there for me. The meeting began with a practiced recitation of their woes, a dramatic recounting of their impending financial ruin, their voices laced with thinly veiled accusations of my abandonment. My mother sobbed theatrically, my father cleared his throat repeatedly, punctuating his lamentations with appeals to family honor. Brittany, ever the echo, chimed in with her own laments about how unfair it all was. I listened, quietly, patiently, letting their words wash over me without penetration. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a play unfold, rather than living it. When they finally paused, expecting me to break, to offer a solution, to once again step into the role of their savior, I took a deep breath. I understand your current situation, I began, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the emotional noise. And I'm sorry you're going through this. My words were measured, devoid of malice, but also devoid of warmth. However, let's be clear about how we arrived here. I pulled out my neatly organized folder of documents. Bank statements, dated texts, printed emails. For 2 years, I continued, holding up a stack of bank statements. I contributed $5, $600 a month to this mortgage. That's a total of over $130,000. I laid the printouts on the coffee table, a stark, undeniable testament to my contributions. Then I paused, letting the numbers sink in. The silence in the room was deafening. My parents exchanged startled glances. Brittany looked away, her face burning. And then I said, my voice unwavering, one morning, I received a text message from my mother. I read it aloud, word for word, the chilling precision of their original message echoing in the quiet room. We've changed the locks and the gate code. We no longer trust you. I looked directly at my mother, then my father, then Brittany. You told me you no longer trusted me. You changed the locks on the house I was paying for. You effectively evicted me from a home that, financially, I was keeping afloat. My voice remained steady, but there was an undeniable steel beneath its calm surface. You made your choice. You decided you didn't need me, that I wasn't welcome. And now, you're experiencing the consequences of that choice. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but my father put a hand on her arm, his face pale. Even he, it seemed, understood the weight of my words. I gave. You took, I stated, each word a distinct hammer blow. And when you thought you didn't need me, you locked the door behind me. Now it's your turn to figure it out. I stood up. Daniel rose with me, a silent pillar of support. I looked at the stunned faces around the room, the shock, the dawning realization of their miscalculation. There were no tears from me, no anger. Just a profound sense of clarity, a quiet certainty that I was doing the right thing for myself. "I wish you well," I said, a final, polite dismissal. "But I will no longer be providing financial support." And then, with a calm that surprised even myself, I turned and walked out, Daniel by my side. The silence that followed us out the door was the sound of a universe realigning, of a quiet revenge beginning to unfold, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, unwavering power of self-worth. They hadn't fully realized what was happening until it was too late. And now the unraveling had truly begun. The unraveling began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a fraying thread at the edge of a tapestry. Then, with an increasing velocity, it accelerated, pulling apart the carefully constructed lives of my parents and Brittany. I wasn't actively seeking their downfall, I was simply no longer propping them up. And in the absence of my support, their world, which had always relied on external scaffolding, began to buckle. The first ripple was the most immediate, the foreclosure. The family home, that grand colonial monument to their perceived status, went into default. I heard it through Aunt Catherine, who, after the family meeting, became a surprising confidant. She called, not with judgment, but with a quiet sense of grim satisfaction. "The bank's moving fast, Miranda," she'd say, her voice low. "Your mother's beside herself. Says it's all your fault." I'd listen, a strange mix of emotions swirling within me. There was no joy in their suffering, but there was a quiet understanding that this was the natural consequence of their actions. The house, which had once felt like a symbol of their power over me, became a testament to their short-sightedness, their greed. It was eventually sold, the proceeds barely covering their debts, leaving them with little to nothing. The grand facade had crumbled, leaving behind only the stark reality of their choices. Brittany's world, built on a foundation of entitlement and borrowed illusions, was the next to crack. Her marriage to Jeremy, the grifter, had always been precarious, held together by superficial aspirations and a shared aversion to real work. Without the steady flow of my money, the financial pressures became unbearable. I heard, again through the family grapevine, of their increasingly explosive arguments, of Jeremy's sudden disappearances. Eventually, the news came. They were divorcing. Brittany, who had never truly learned to stand on her own 2 feet, found herself adrift. She reached out, tentatively at first, then with increasing desperation. Texts filled with thinly veiled accusations. "You really left us in the lurch, Miranda," mixed with pleas for advice, for just a little help to get her back on track. I didn't respond. The silence was my answer. I had spent a lifetime propping her up. It was time for her to find her own balance. My parents, forced to downsize dramatically, moved into a small, nondescript condo in a far less desirable suburb. The shock of losing their status, their comfortable existence, seemed to age them overnight. My mother, once meticulously groomed, began to neglect her appearance. My father, always so stoic, became withdrawn, his silences even more pronounced. They reached out, sporadically, with watered-down apologies, hesitant overtures that felt more like attempts to gauge my current financial position than genuine remorse. "I hope you're well, darling," my mother would text, the familiar term of endearment now feeling hollow and manipulative. "We may have made some mistakes," my father would venture in a stilted voicemail. But the damage was done. The trust, once so carelessly shattered, could not be so easily reassembled with a few carefully chosen words. I would reply with polite, non-committal texts, always keeping them at an emotional distance. "I am well, thank you." Understood. No room for further discussion, no opening for them to re-enter my life on their old terms. Meanwhile, my own life, unburdened by their constant demands, began to flourish. The quiet planning I had engaged in during my period of devastation now bore fruit. Free from the immense financial drain of their mortgage, my savings grew rapidly. I was able to fully commit to my own goals, to invest in myself without reservation. I threw myself into my work, my focus sharper, my energy boundless. My dedication was noticed. Within 6 months of cutting ties, I received a promotion at work, a significant bump in salary and responsibility. It was a victory, not just professionally, but personally, a tangible symbol of my reclaimed agency. Daniel, my steadfast anchor, was a constant source of support and quiet joy. Our relationship deepened, strengthened by the shared experience of navigating this difficult period. He had seen me at my most vulnerable, and his unwavering presence had been a profound comfort. We started talking about the future, about building a life together, a life founded on mutual respect and genuine love, not on obligation or manipulation. We found a beautiful condo in a neighborhood we both loved, a bright, airy space with large windows overlooking a vibrant city park. Moving in with him felt like stepping into a new chapter, a clean slate, a life I was actively choosing, not one I was passively accepting. The process of healing was not linear, nor was it always easy. There were still moments of raw pain, sudden flashes of memory that brought back the sting of betrayal. A particular song, a familiar scent, a glimpse of a similar house would trigger a wave of grief for the family I had lost, the idealized version that had existed only in my mind. But each time, the waves would recede, leaving behind not despair, but a clearer understanding of my own resilience. I started therapy, a quiet space to process the trauma, to unpack the decades of unspoken expectations and buried emotions. My therapist, a kind and insightful woman, helped me understand the insidious nature of familial emotional manipulation, the deep-seated patterns that had kept me trapped for so long. She helped me grieve not just the betrayal, but the lost innocence, the childhood belief in unconditional love that had been so cruelly shattered. It was a slow, deliberate excavation, but with each session, another layer of pain was gently peeled away, revealing a stronger, more authentic core. I reclaimed my peace, not through grand acts of vengeance, but through small, deliberate choices. Choosing quiet evenings with Daniel over chaotic family dinners. Investing in my own future instead of theirs. Prioritizing my well-being over their manufactured crises. The anger, which had simmered beneath the surface for so long, eventually dissipated, replaced by a quiet, settled acceptance. I understood that their actions were a reflection of their own limitations, their own insecurities, not a reflection of my worth. The consequences of their betrayal were not something I sought to inflict, but rather the natural unfolding of a path they had chosen. And in watching their world unravel, I found a deeper understanding of my own strength, my own capacity for healing, and my profound ability to choose myself, without guilt, without drama, and finally, with true, unshakable peace. 1 year later, the world had shifted, settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The chaos had subsided, the dust had long since settled. My life with Daniel was a tapestry woven with mutual respect, shared laughter, and a deep, comforting sense of security. My career continued to flourish, a testament to my own hard work and resilience. I had built a new foundation, brick by brick, on solid ground. Then came the unexpected invitation. A text from my mother, simple and direct. Coffee? Just us. No apologies, no veiled pleas, just a quiet request. I hesitated for a moment, the old patterns of fear and obligation flaring briefly, but then I recognized it for what it was, an opportunity to see how far I had come, to face a part of my past on my own terms. I agreed. We met at a small, unassuming coffee shop, a neutral territory far from the ghosts of the family home. The air was cool and crisp, the city sounds a distant hum. My mother looked different. Her meticulously styled hair was a little less perfect, her clothes a little less polished. There was a vulnerability in her eyes I had never seen before, a quiet resignation. We made small talk, awkward at first, about the weather, about our respective lives. She mentioned Brittany briefly, confirming what I already knew, that Brittany was struggling, living a fractured, uncertain existence. There was no judgment in her voice, only a weary sadness. Then she looked at me, truly looked at me, across the small table, her gaze steady, almost searching. "You know, Miranda," she began, her voice low, a surprising tremor in it, "when we changed the locks, when we told you we didn't trust you." She paused, her eyes clouding with something akin to regret. We thought you would fight. We thought you would scream, or cry, or beg. We thought you would come back. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air, a confession echoing in the quiet space between us. But you didn't, she continued, her voice barely a whisper. You just stopped. You just walked away. She took a sip of her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. And everything fell apart. I waited. There was no apology, not truly. Not in the way I once craved, the desperate, begging kind. But there was something else, something deeper in her eyes. A recognition. You broke the cycle, Miranda, she said, finally, her voice thick with emotion. You did what I couldn't. What my mother couldn't. You stopped giving. You chose yourself. She looked away then, her gaze distant, lost in memories I could only guess at. I always thought you had to burn yourself to keep others warm. That it was your duty. Your sacrifice. She turned back to me, her eyes clear now, if still shadowed with a profound sadness. But you found your way back from the fire. And you're stronger for it. Her words were a strange kind of absolution, not for her, but for me. A confirmation from the very source of my pain that my actions, my quiet reclamation, had been justified. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the traditional sense, because some things, some wounds, don't demand forgiveness. They demand acknowledgement and then release. I didn't hold on to the bitterness, the festering resentment that had once threatened to consume me. It had served its purpose, igniting the spark of my transformation. Now it was simply gone. I wasn't the same person I was before. The naive girl who had endlessly sacrificed for a family that didn't truly see her was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in fire, tempered by betrayal, but not defined by it. I carried the scars, yes, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were faint lines, reminders of where I had been and how far I had come. I was free, not just from their demands, but from the internal chains I had unknowingly worn for so long. The resolution wasn't a neat, tied-up bow. Life rarely is. But it was a profound clarity, a deep-seated peace that permeated every aspect of my being. I understood now that self-love wasn't selfish, it was essential. That boundaries weren't cruel, they were an act of profound kindness to oneself. And that sometimes the bravest love is choosing yourself. It's walking away from the people who diminish you, not out of anger, but out of a fierce, unwavering commitment to your own well-being. And so I close this chapter, not with a flourish, but with a quiet exhale. My story isn't unique. Betrayal, in its myriad forms, touches countless lives. But the journey back, the quiet rise from the ashes, that is the true story. Have you found your way back from betrayal? Have you dared to choose yourself, even when it meant walking away from everything you thought you knew?